Now I guess today we'll talk about some more rambling. I'll just talk about things and events and people that I recall, or things that were told to me by my parents or my grandparents, or things that I witnessed or took part in. These things would primarily be of some interest to members of the family. Naturally, one of the biggest events that affected the family history in the early days, other than the hardship, you might say, of the Grambuas and the Grambergs homesteading in Belknap and in the Metz Township of Presque County, that was the Great Metz Fire of October of 1908. From the time that I can recall, about age 3.5 or 4, about 1914-15, the big topic of conversation in family groups was always the Metz Fire. Conversations started by saying that the event was before or after the Metz Fire. Many articles have been written about that event. So what I'll talk about is only how it affected the Gramberg or the Gramberg families. On the Gramberg side, the fire loss to the home and to the farm, everything was a total loss. I recall that only one horse survived that fire, and that was severely handicapped and never used again for any hard work. These were just things that were told to me. The only thing that the survivors had was the clothes on their back. They saved themselves and his mother and grandmother, great-grandmother Peggy, Bertha and Louise and Dora and Carl, by stationing themselves in an open plowed field which was near the home. There was absolutely nothing left that you could carry away from that farm. Everything except the clothes on their back was gone. The home was destroyed and everything in it. The farm, buildings, sheds, cattle, horses, sheep, everything is gone. Even the dogs, even the cats. Grain, all machinery, all wood, all tools, except a few things that survived out in the open fields. The sheds, the cultivators, the binders, harvesters, harness, everything lost. First thing, of course, was to find shelter and food. Now, one of the, you might say, miracles of the Metz Fire was that the Herman Grambua farm, with its home and buildings, sheds, and even a straw stack, only about a half a mile away from the Grambua farm, was totally untouched. Where around it for miles, everything was swept in this great firestorm. And you've got to remember that this firestorm was going through virgin woods, timbers and pine, in every direction that you can think of. Well, how come? Well, who knows? They used to translate it, as I remember, from the German. They used to say, this was saved by the hand of God. translating from crude German, they would say, errettet, mit der Hand Gottes. Everything had been destroyed. And people, of course, flocked to the Grambua farm as if it was an oasis. The word got out, and people, of course, came. Occupied every square inch of the farm, and the farm buildings, and the granary, and the school, just to have shelter, a roof over their head. Fortunately, my grandmother had a large supply of fresh flour that had just been received from the mill. And she made a lot of pancakes and a lot of muffins out of that flour for those people. Now you got to remember, these people lost everything. And in some of those families, of course, there are also people that lost loved ones. People died in those fires. In the immediate family, in the Hardy's family, which was the old homestead of the Dramberg family, a sister of grandfather Dramberg's and her 3 daughters perished. Now, they didn't perish on the homestead, but they made their way toward Metz, and they got into a gondola with a car which was going to take them out of Metz. The only trouble was the gondola got caught between racks of timber that were piled on both sides of the track. The track spread, and they were cremated. Many, many people were cremated right in those railroad cars. My grandmother, Vicky, who was living with them, Bertha, Carl, Dora, Louise, saved themselves, along with several neighbor children who got as far as the Dramberg farm after having been dismissed out of school. They couldn't get home, so they were encouraged to stay there with him, and they also survived. Now, some of these family names were family names like Bujic, there was Ulrich, there was Legners, there were Centellas. There were 6 or 7 kids that survived out in that open field because they couldn't get any further. They just absolutely could not get any further than that, and they had to wait until the next day in many cases before they could find enough ways to get home, to find out what's going to happen to their families. Now, of course, you got to remember, these people lost everything except the clothes on their back. It wasn't long before, of course, when help came, people in the surrounding townships that hadn't burned out soon came with help, came to get those people in many cases, just came to get them out of there, to get them back into homes, to get them into shelters. And they, of course, went back, and then they started bringing in food and blankets and clothes. But the primary thing was to get these people in some kind of shelter situation. Now, help soon came. Help came by way of the railroad. Help came by way of help from Posen, other portions of the county, from Hillman and Lachine and Big Rapids and other places. People came in with wagon loads of supplies and goods and clothes and you name it. And of course, gradually state assistance and help from the Red Cross also came. Church groups came in from down below and helped to build homes, temporary homes for these people. They brought it only, they not only brought themselves, they brought money, and they brought lumber with them. And they built small homes on these farms that had been built out. One of those homes is still standing on the Dramberg farm, and that was used by the farm, used by that family afterwards until they built a new home. It was still standing there today and still being used as a home. That was built temporarily by these people that came in, these church groups. I do not know, but I think they were related to the Mennonites. And these were all donated. This material was donated. Time was donated. Money was donated. They just came in to help. Everything, of course, as you can imagine, what a task that would be for any family, and not just Grambua or the Grambua family, but all the rest of them that lost everything, to start all over again from scratch. You can imagine a woman of the household having to get everything back together again, even to cook meals. All the pots and pans, kettles, and tools, knives, forks, spoons, kettles, all of the ingredients to cook a meal, all the flour, the salt, pepper, and spices, needles and thread, and buttons and shoes and laces. Everything that went into a household had to be reestablished. You can imagine rebuilding your life from the word go on. The same thing was true with the farmer. The same thing was true with the farmer. He had to reestablish his stock. He had to reestablish his horses, and cattle, and sheep, and pigs, and ducks, and what have you, and all the materials that went with it. It was no easy task, and you got to give those people credit. They stuck to it. And but, of course, to those people, land was the source of all wealth. They'd come out of Europe, and that's why they came. They came to get land. The land was still there, and the land would not be destroyed. Because man had to work his land and get his crop. But at the present time, what he needed immediately, he needed cash. He needed money to restock and retool his tools of production. Now, fortunately for the Dramberg family, there was help that came quite abundantly from Detroit. Grandfather Dramberg's sister, Augusta, had married Ed Voigt, who was a well-known philanthropist and brewer in Detroit, and another sister, Marie, had married a man by the name of Zimmerman, who was the brewmaster at the Voigt Brewery. They were somewhat well-to-do, and so they arranged for just tremendous quantities of goods of all types to be immediately shipped up by D&M Railroad. And that included, from Ed Voigt, horses to reestablish the farm, because he had horses available from his brewery. And so they were fortunate in that respect, that they not only set up enough for that immediate family, but to also to help all the others. Because they had to reestablish all their farm machinery. They had to reestablish all the grains that they could use for planting. Every story, every community, or every family had stories to tell that were different from the next one. But they were all tragedy. A few days after they met fire, Bertha and Louise Dramberg, young girls, left Metz by train to go to Alpena to live with some friends. After all, they had nothing, you might say, except the clothes on their back. And so word came, and so the girls went to Alpena, and there a family friend took them in and helped them get reclothed and helped them find jobs. Bertha, I think, found a job at a store as a clerk, and Louise found a job as a homemaker with some family in Alpena. Now this was early in 1910, or this was in 1908, right after the fire, and so They stayed there for a while in Alpena, and then Bertha and Louise moved on to Toledo, Ohio. Now, the reason that they moved on to Toledo, Ohio, was that there are a lot of relatives of the Hardees family, that is Grandma Dramberg's family, living in Toledo. Great-great-grandmother Paitke had a good number of daughters and a sister that lived in the Toledo area. And there were family names there, such as the Lukes, the Crefts, the Perlicks, the Groovies. And so they wanted those girls to come down there. And there was employment down there, a lot of employment in the Toledo area. So the girls took a train and went down there, and sure enough, it wasn't long before they found jobs. And then after a period of, I don't know just how long, the girls decided that they wanted to become nurses. I don't know just what the background to this story was, but anyway, they made an application to the nursing school at Robin Hood Hospital in Toledo, and they were accepted for training. Now, I don't know the story as to how these girls with just an 8th grade education got around the fact that they had never attended high school and would be admitted for nurses training. But that wasn't at all uncommon in those days, because after all, there were many, many small towns in Ohio as well as in Michigan that did not have high schools. And we do know that students from these schools were quite often admitted into higher schools or universities for purposes of study. And if they could pass the necessary, you might say, entrance examinations, well founded in, say, reading and writing, vocabulary, mathematics, and they were admitted, given a chance, given a tryout. That isn't at all unusual. You'll have to recall that our dad, George Grambua, he never went to any high school, but he was given an opportunity when he went to Central Michigan, because he had a pretty good background in math, pretty good background in vocabulary and science and spelling, and they gave him a chance to see whether he could, as you say, cut the mustard, and he did. That was very common, because Rogers City at that time did not have a high school. And in fact, they didn't have a full high school, until about 1917. I know that Uncle Ed Grambua, attended a couple of years of high school here in 9th and 10th grade, and then he went on and attended Michigan State College, Agriculture College. Also, Ed Hardees from Belknap. He just went through the 8th grade out to the Belknap school there, and then he went to Michigan State. He got his PhD in agriculture, attending Michigan State College of Agriculture and Applied Science. So it could be done. And that was true with, of course, many, many students that attended the other schools in Michigan, such as Ferris. Ferris accepted students for their pharmacy department and their business department and banking department, who from the schools in northern Michigan where they did not have high schools. But if they could do the work, they were given the opportunity. Now, Bertha and Louise, they went into the nursing school and graduated as nurses, as RNs. And just about the time that they completed their RN training, World War I broke out. And so they volunteered as Army nurses to go to France. They were waiting to board ship along the eastern seaboard. I think it was around someplace in Georgia. Take a boat to France to serve with the armed forces over there. when the armistice came. And so they never did go overseas. But they did stay on and became government nurses. And they served in the veterans hospitals of the United States from one end of the country to the other. I do know that they served in places like Dallas. They served in Philadelphia, New Orleans, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Seattle, Portland, St. Paul, and Fort Snelling, to give you an idea. So that's just one of those things that happened in the family. But I just thought I'd mention that. Yeah, I gotta give those people credit. In those days, they got it the hard way, even though they never had a chance. Now, other ramblings that we'll talk about. I know that in our family, in the George Grambua family here in Rogers City, Michigan, music was always important. And Mother and Dad were kind of musically inclined. Mother was an excellent player on the old pump organ, and as a young girl learned the instrument from a Reverend Teamy, who was a minister of the St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Metz, Michigan. He had a good number of pupils, and many of the farmers out in that area bought organs for their home. And Mother, for several years as a young girl, up until the time that she got married, was the organist at the St. Peter's Lutheran Church in Metz. And according to what people have told me, that she did a very, very good job. I recall her playing at home, and I recall Dad also could do a pretty good job. He played at Christmas and Easter and the 4th of July. I often wonder who got the old accordion. My dad encouraged all of us 6 kids to learn to play some musical instrument. Herman took to the violin lessons and became somewhat accomplished. And I recall that he played at assemblies in the old brick high school. He took lessons from a Professor Beauregard. And I also took violin lessons from Professor Beauregard, and also took violin lessons from an Otto Steffen. Now, the Steffens had a building which is still there today, the Zagorski McKinney plumbing shop was the old Steffen building. That was originally, part of it was shoe shop, part of it was a haberdashery where they sold men's clothing. And I took lessons from Otto. Otto later became a chiropractor and practiced in Alpena, chiropractic. I quit the violin because, as I said, there was just too much noise in that one ear. And then I took piano lessons from a Miss Lorraine Lendorf Hoffman, as did many a kid in Rogers City. She had many students. And again, I was not much of a piano player. Then along about 1928, they started to organize very informally a kind of a Rogers City High School band. And somebody loaned me a old baritone saxophone, for which I bought a new mouthpiece, and a Mr. Baker proceeded to show me how to play that instrument. I thought I was pretty good, to the point where I convinced my dad that he should buy me a new saxophone. So he bought me a E-flat alto saxophone made by the King people. And I tooted around on that thing until about 1930, and then I went to Michigan State. Years afterwards, I guess Treese tried to play that instrument, but I know that eventually Dad sold it and got some of his money back out of it. George, my brother George, he took piano lessons And Ernestine also took piano lessons. And I guess Ernestine also tried the violin for a while. And Treese, she tried the saxophone before my dad sold mine. Ernestine reminded me of a comedic affair that used to occur when all the kids were home and we're all practicing on instruments. We had a dog, one of the Kazans, that when you hit certain keys on the piano, he would sit next to the piano and raise up his head like a wolf and howl. The darndest bellowing, quailing noise that you ever heard in your life. And of course that fascinated the kids, and so the dog howled frequently. But it was all a part of the family fun. But the only real musician in the family was Mother. And even though the rest of us tried to do our best. I recall that when Mother and Dad got a piano, that the old pump organ at that time was given to the St. Peter's Lutheran Church in Metz. Now that was the church that they attended as young people. Now it wasn't the same building because the church that they attended had burned in the Metz fire of 1908, but the new building had been built on the same site. Now, whether the organ that the folks gave after this was after the fire is still there or not, or still being used, I don't know, or what happened to it. I do not know. Now I'd like to talk for a few minutes about another item that most of the kids in the family know about. I want to talk about the big pine tree and its relationship to the George Grambua family in Rogers City. We have to go back to the Metz fire of 1908. When the fire swept through this heavily forested area, there were a few trees that were spared or just singed, and these were harvested for timber and lumber by individuals and lumber companies. There was one big monster pine tree on the Drambert property which was intact. And grandfather and grandmother Drambert offered the tree to George and Alma, who had been married in May of 1908. Now, they lived in Rogers City and in a small apartment, but Dad had bought a lot on 3rd Street looking to the future and a home site. That's the place where the home is now situated. Now, in the winter following the fire, Dad, his brothers, and family friends cut down that big pine tree, approximately 125 foot tall, they said, and about 6.5 feet in diameter at the base. A real monster. It was cut into 8, 10, and 12 foot lengths, and it was loaded on sleighs, and the logs were hauled to a mill near Hawks that had escaped the fire. The logs were cut into board material of 4-inch, 6, 8-inch widths, 16-inch widths, and the framing material was cut to make 2x4s, 2x6, 2x8, 2x10, 12x12. Then arrangements were made for the finished lumber to be transported by wagon or sleigh to Rogers City, and a good amount of that lumber was stored in a horse barn, which is now the garage that had been built on that lot that George and Alma owned on 3rd Street in Rogers City. That's the same building that is there today. In other words, the horse barn was built first. And it was built first to house the lumber that they would accumulate to build their home. And then later, of course, it was just used as a horse barn. Some of the boards, of course, were plain that they had, and were used for finish work in the home and for building shelves and trim and around the windows and doors, both inside and outside of the house. Now, I don't want to give the impression that that tree supplied all the lumber for that house. That is not the case. That was built. That home was built in 1911, 1912. And my mother did say that it was a very, very big savings. Most of the kids, you might say, including me, have pictures of that big tree and shows a large party gathered at the base of that tree where they're just about to cut that tree down. On that picture is not only Julius and Therese Gramberg, there's Alva and George Grambua, there's Uncle Carl, there's Aunt Bertha, Aunt Dora, Uncle Henry, Uncle Otto, Uncle Ed, there's Mama Dema Henry Waring, Ed Shute, and a few others. They were the group that cut that tree down and then helped cut it in sections, loaded it onto sleighs, and took it to Hawks, to the mills. Now, another story that comes out of the Metz relationship, and that happened on the Dramberg farm, was the episode of the Foxfire. I've told people about this before. I was witness to this phenomenon along with Julius and Teresa Dramberg. I recall it was the summer of 1920. Grandfather Dramberg and I had just returned from St. Louis, Missouri, where we had gone for polio treatment. And I had talked about this previously. In this event, Grandfather Dramberg had walked over the field to see his neighbor, Herman Grambua, on the next farm. This was in the evening just before dark. We returned after dark and asked grandmother and I to come with him to see a strange phenomenon. In a swampy area between the two farms, when we got to the top of the rise and could see the low swamp area, we could see an eerie light that danced or moved in a small area along the rim of the swamp. Now, Grandfather had walked right by it when it appeared, and he said that he was really startled. There was no sound, and he felt no heat. Just a bluish, lavender flame or flare that danced. A kind of a transparent light. Now, we walked within probably about 50 feet. And I guess we stayed there for probably about 15, 20 minutes, wondering what it was all about, what it meant or what it signified. Now, my grandfather had said that he had heard about this phenomenon in Europe, but he had never witnessed it. He told me later that he saw that fire again in the same area on several occasions in later years. And also that Herman Grambua had seen the same phenomena. No doubt some gaseous material that was derived from fermentation or carbons escaping or other underground gases which seemed to light naturally I don't know which. Now another event that comes out of the episodes that I remember from the Mets area was this was the early days again, was the huckleberry picking, the annual huckleberry picking event that originated in the Mets area. Again, the neighbors in the Grambua farm every summer, about August, when the huckleberries were ripe in the plains area around Lake May in Bismarck Township. These were lands that had been harvested of their pine and had been swept by fire on various occasions, and so that the growth, the new berry growth, was very, very abundant. So harvesting was ordered on a yearly basis of this group of people. And on a given day, it seems that the entire neighborhood, including the Drambergs, the Grambos, and the Kovalevskis, the Hardises, the Buziks, the Schraders, the Rorings, Richards, Lipkes, Schultzes, Ulriches, Satellas, Konechny's, Lagners, Hines, Verslonkas, Shamanskys, Kapalas. These people, with horse and wagon and wooden boats, went to Lake May to set up a camp and pick huckleberries. They went fishing. They fished for pike and bullheads. They went swimming. Now remember that these areas had been scouted previously, ahead of time, and including that year, to tell my grandfather, Julius Dramberg, was usually one of the scouts that went out ahead of time. They walked to this area, probably 10, 12 miles away, and scouted the area to make sure that there was a good crop there. This was about an 11 or 12 mile trek by wagon and horse, and it took about 4 to 5 hours. I remember that the wagons left Metz about 4 o'clock in the morning and arrived at the Lake May campgrounds about 9 or 10 a.m. Most of the folks immediately started the berry picking. Some stayed to make camp, put up tents for the night, for sleeping, tents for cooking, and they built tables and benches because they had brought along boards and their saws and nails, tables to eat on, tables, benches to sit on, tables to prepare food on, and they built a fire pit for cooking. Fresh water was secured from the spring. Now, all these families that came, all the O'Dig families, 5, 6, 7, or 8 families, brought along a certain amount of food. But as I remember, they usually cooked one big thing for everybody. And that was prepared a big dish. And I remember the one time that the big dish that I tasted raw for good to me was corned beef. Corned beef. It was made with cabbage and potatoes, rutabagas. And it was what you call a modern day tramp roast, you might say. This was cooked in a very large metal kettle, black metal kettle, that was cooked directly over the fire on a metal hook. My guess is that kettle, black iron, held at least 10 gallons in size. That's big. But remember, there were probably 30 to 35 to 40 people that were at this big berry picking event and cookout. And there were 6, 7, or 8 different families. Now this event ordinarily occurred every year. And it had been going on for some time, because I know my mother said that even as a young girl, they went out there to pick these berries in certain plains area where there were very light cover of trees. As I remember it, they went usually probably on a Friday. They left early Friday morning. They stayed overnight. Now, some of the men, you got to remember, on Friday night, they had to go back, and because the cattle had to be attended to, they had to be milked, and they had to be milked again the next morning. But these fellows had a buggy and an extra horse, and they went back and did the necessary chores that had to be done on their individual farms. Now, maybe there was somebody left on those individual farms, maybe some older people or younger people, whatever the case might be. But nevertheless, they went back to help out, and then the next day they came back again, and they stayed overnight. Friday night they stayed overnight, camped out, they sang songs, and somebody brought along a harmonica or other small instrument like a Jew's harp and okra, and they sang songs until early in the morning. Some of the fellows went fishing for bullheads at night, and then in the evening there, a lot of people went for a swim. But I understand that this site that they had at Lake May was a site that they always returned to. It was a kind of a natural campground, and there was a beautiful spring close by where they had fresh water, not only to make their coffee and tea, but also and for their horses. And it was just a beautiful affair. And then on Saturday evening, they returned. I recall on one occasion that Mother and Dad, they came to Metz and took part in this. And they came to Metz and by horse and buggy, and then they kept right on going to Lake May and took part in this event. So that's just one of the things that happened before the automobiles. And then those berries, of course, were canned. They were eaten fresh. And I guess some of them they even found out how to dry them. Some said that they had dried those berries, some process that they had. And so they kind of, but I guess that's true. I guess they do it today. I don't remember just what happened there. But nevertheless, that was an outing. That's what the primary purpose was there. Well, we'll see how we're coming along here.